All right, so I'm going to kick us off. If I didn't already say welcome, welcome everyone. So my name is Maurizio Martinelli. I work for an organization called Florida Sea Grant. I work here in the state on coral disease issues, but today I'm here to share my love of marine invertebrates with all of you. So what we have today is a course that's part of a series that is put on by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection's Coral Reef Conservation Program. And so already we have had Marine Invertebrate Part 1 and Reef Fish Part 2. Part 1. And today we're going to be covering Marine Invert Part 2. And then on Thursday, there's Reef Fish Part 2. And then starting next week, there's going to be additional courses. One is a training on bleach watch. There are going to be a couple that are related to stony coral identification, one coral reef story time, which last year was a huge hit. And then a webinar that's about protecting Florida's coral reef and the citizen science reporting tool CSAM. So this is one of the ways that we here in kind of the Florida coral world like to celebrate Earth Month. And so I'd like to always start out by saying Happy Earth Month, everyone. I know everyone kind of celebrates Earth Month differently. Maybe you don't celebrate it at all, but I always like to take Earth Month as an opportunity to kind of think about my interaction and my relationship with nature, and to sort of think about the ways that I interact with it, the ways that maybe I can better interact with it, but also really focusing on my appreciation for it. And so one of the reasons that I love doing this course is because I absolutely adore marine inverts. And so really my hope is that today I can share some of my love of these animals with you, and maybe it can be part of your Earth Month celebration to also take some time and appreciate the wonderful inverts that we have here in Florida. So a bit of housekeeping. In addition to kind of all these other courses, if you go to the link that's at the top, you can register for these, or otherwise there is a handout I think that you should be able to access in the panel, the kind of GoToWebinar panel, where if you click on that, you can click directly to register for these webinars if you're interested in kind of learning more. Technology-wise, so there, you hopefully already saw the first poll. We're going to have a couple more polls that pop up throughout the course. But otherwise, I am going to be asking you some questions to throw out some guesses. And my ask of you is that I know it says it's the question box, and that's a place where you could put in questions for me or for Rachel. And we'll try to answer them as we go. But also when I ask you to kind of just answer a question, you can drop what you think is the answer into that question box, and Rachel will be able to read off some of the answers that we're getting. For the most part, you are going to remain muted today. It just kind of helps with organization. But if you do have a question and we have time for questions, we will be able to unmute you, and so you can ask me directly. I want to note that this webinar is recorded, or is being recorded. So also if you have to drop off a little bit early, or I tend to go late with these things, and I apologize in advance, but if you can't stay for the whole thing, genuinely no worries. You can check out the recording at a later time. So I'm going to quickly introduce two things. The first is the star of our show, which is Florida's coral reef. So Florida's coral reef, it stretches for about 350 miles from Martin County up here in the north. Then it stretches down past all of the counties of southeast Florida before hooking around Biscayne National Park, the Florida Keys, and then shooting out to the dry Tortugas region way out in the west. So this is a really substantial natural figure. 350 miles is about if you drove from Miami to Jacksonville. So it is a really large kind of piece of ecology. And what's really fascinating about this is that throughout its entire 350-mile stretch, it has really amazing diversity. It has great ecological value, but it also provides us with a lot of what we call ecosystem services. So, I was also supposed to introduce myself. So my name is Maurizio Martinelli. I'm the state's Coral Disease Response Coordinator. So you may have heard potentially, or you may hear in potentially the coral courses that there is an active disease outbreak that's been going on in Florida. And it's my job to work with all the folks throughout the state to try to learn about this disease and respond to it. I'm based out of Miami, and I love all of the inverts that I'm going to be sharing with you today. And so that's why I always ask to do this course. But kind of as I was mentioning, the coral reef that we have here in Florida, it has this amazing ecological value, which is basically a way of saying that there is a huge amount of diversity that lives all along the 350 miles of reef. Many of the things that live here, they are, vertebrates, things like fish, but there are also a ton of marine invertebrates that are important for everything from things like nutrient cycling, for being what we call either the lawnmowers or the janitors of the reef. They play really important parts in like the food web. And so there's really amazing ecology here. Now, one of the stats that you might hear about coral reefs kind of generally in the world is that they make up less than 1% of the ocean, but they might house up to 25% of the marine species. And so in many ways, you can think of these coral reefs as like the mega cities of the ocean, because they don't take up a huge amount of space, but they pack an enormous amount of life into them. And so that's why they have this great ecological value. But also, they provide a lot of what we call ecosystem services to humans. So they give us a lot back in return. And especially somewhere like Florida, where we have this coral reef that is so close to shore, it does a lot for us. So in addition to housing a lot of the fish that we like to fish here in South Florida, in addition to giving us ways to recreate, so we can dive on these and swim on them, snorkel them, they provide nice waves if we want to go surfing. But one of the really, really huge values is that they are the first line of defense against the ocean for the land. By which I mean when we have lots of wave action that comes in, or when a storm comes in, the coral reefs are the first line of protection that we have against things like flooding or things like wave action. And when they did a recent kind of economic study of this, the value was in the millions and millions of dollars. And when we have a huge storm that comes in, like an Irma that comes through, the protection that it provides, the prevention of flooding that provides, is over $1 billion. So this is a very, very important ecosystem, not just because of all the critters and fish that live there, but also because of the services that they provide us here in South Florida. So today what we're going to talk about is we're going to first just cover basically what do we mean by invertebrate and why should we care about these animals. I will share a simplified phylogeny of the animal kingdom, and then we're going to go through the identification of the common critters in 4 marine phyla, which are Mollusca, Annelida, Arthropoda, and Echinodermata. Now, if any of these words don't mean anything to you, that is awesome. My hope is that by the end of this course, you'll understand what a phylogeny is, you'll know kind of what the common critters in these different groups are, and hopefully you will share some of the love that I have for these animals. And then at the end, we're going to wrap up with a very difficult and rigorous, super important quiz. But to start, kind of one more poll before we really get into it. Rachel, can you share the second poll? I just want to know how comfortable you already might be in identification of Florida critters. And I can't see the poll, but I'm stalling.
Yes.
Awesome. We'll give folks another, say, 10 seconds to choose how comfortable you are with this identification. All right, how's it looking, Rachel?
Yep, we've got most people have voted. And I've shared it on the screen so folks can view it, but just so you know, Maurizio, 44% of people, so most of them can identify more than a few marine invertebrates, and then another 30% can identify a few. And then we actually do have a couple folks who are lean, mean marine invertebrate identification machines.
Awesome. Well, then I hope I don't put my foot in my mouth today for all you lean, mean machines. But awesome. So I hope that you're not going to already know all these animals, and by the end, you'll be able to identify a few more than you were when we first started. It also sounds like most of y'all might already know kind of what invertebrates are, and so I won't belabor this point too much, but just so we're all on the same page, basically invertebrates are all of the animals that neither possess nor at any point in their life develop a backbone. And what that means is that it is all of the animals out there except for the fish, the reptiles, the amphibians, the birds, and the mammals. So this is a huge group of animals. To the tune of 97% of all known species are invertebrates, which means that invertebrate is not really the most useful organization or the most useful category because it's just so diverse. And it's to the tune of, you have these families and orders of invertebrates that are more diverse and complex than this subphylum Vertebrata. But despite having so many animals, despite being so diverse, vertebrates still tend to get all of the attention. And whenever you think of things like conservation, it's oftentimes you think of like conservation of like elephants or pandas or what we call these charismatic megafauna. And basically all of the charismatic megafauna are vertebrates. What I'm here to advocate for today is that invertebrates also deserve our love and our protection and our attention. And the reason is because in addition to just having, so many animals in this category, they are also super important to their ecosystems. As I mentioned, they do things like they clean up the ecosystems for us, they cycle nutrients, they serve very important parts of the food chain, and more. I also like to include pictures here, like you can see at the bottom, they're actually a Pacific species and species from the Indian Ocean. And the reason is to remind folks, we love to focus on Florida here in Florida, but there are amazing critters across the globe that are also worth our kind of attention and protection. And I always like to show pictures of them. So moving on, I'm going to share that simplified phylogeny, as I mentioned, of the animal kingdom. And the phylogeny is just basically the way that we organize animals within the animal kingdom. So the way that we organized them way before we had any genetic tools to see how genetically similar animals were basically to look at their traits. Because it is much, 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 much more common for two animals that have the same or similar traits to have taken them from a common ancestor rather than evolved them independently. So when you see this example here, that's an elephant and a woolly mammoth, the things that they have, like their trunks and their tusks, their large ears and large body plans, it's really likely that they came from a common ancestor that had those traits, as opposed to they evolved them independently. However, that does happen sometimes, and the example that you see on the right is what we call convergent evolution, where you have two organisms that are pretty distantly related. They're very distantly related. So, a hummingbird and a moth, they don't really come from any common ancestors, but they developed very similar body plans and flight. So that can happen, but it's much, much, much more likely that they came from a common ancestor. And so the phylogeny that I'm about to show you was initially based on basically what they had in common is how we grouped the animals. And later on in the presentation, I will share one example that I think is very cool of where we had this convergent evolution of different kind of distantly related animals developing similar systems. So this is going to be a very simplified phylogeny of the animal kingdom. You can think of it as like that evolutionary tree. But basically all animals, we came from these common single-celled ancestors that at some point developed multicellularity. And the first animals that came off, kind of branched off of this evolutionary tree, are the sponges. And if you joined part one, hopefully you grew a love for sponges. These are some of my favorite animals. They are fascinating. They don't have any true tissue or organs, but just are kind of a collection of specialized cells. They are really, really cool animals, even though they are quite, quote unquote, simple. A little bit later, we had the branch of these jellies, so both the ctenophores and the cnidarians. The ctenophores don't have any stinging cells, while the cnidarians do, and the cnidarians include everything from your true jellies, but also things like sea anemones, corals, and hydra. We also have roundworms and flatworms that are pretty closely related, and it is all of these groups of animals that were covered in part one of the course. And so today we're going to cover some of the other phyla that evolved a little bit later, and that includes the Mollusca, your Annelida, your Arthropoda, and your Echinodermata. And then, of course, as we mentioned, there is that last group of animals, the vertebrates, which are included within the phylum Chordates. But we're not going to talk about chordates at all. We are just today going to be focusing on our four phyla, the thin-shelled mollusks, our segmented worm annelids, the joint-appendaged arthropods, and finally the hedgehog-skinned echinoderms. And we're going to kick things off with my absolute favorite, the mollusca. So, Mollusca is the largest marine phylum. Its membership includes just under 1/4 of all named marine organisms, which means that this is an incredibly diverse phylum. And you can see just from the pictures here, this diversity is not just in terms of kind of how many animals they are, but they have a very diverse range of body plans, their anatomy, basically what they look like, their behavior, and the habitat that they live in. Now, due to this kind of really incredible diversity, it is kind of hard to describe anatomically what unites all of mollusks, but the three most common features are that they have a fleshy mantle. So you can think about that as like this soft part of the snail, or this nice fleshy part of the squid. They have a pretty hard tongue-like organ called a radula, and they all have at least the organization of a nervous system. So you and I have a full-blown nervous system. So we have neurons and nerves throughout our bodies. All mollusks at least have the basic organization of that, but many of them do have a full-blown, very complex nervous system. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the cephalopods. Many of them also have calcareous shells, again, like the snail here, or these bivalves. And many of them also have eyes. And when they don't have eyes, they often still have some sort of visual system many times. So we're going to start off today with this group, the class Gastropoda. And this is the largest class within the phylum of Mollusca. So Gastropoda as a class is second only to the class that includes all insects in the number of overall species. And about 80% of all mollusks fall into this class of Gastropoda. So we're going to start off with one of my favorites. This is called the Flamingo Tongue, or the Siphoma gibbosum. So the Flamingo Tongue, these are all predatory sea snails, and they're known to some as the false cowries. And I'll show you in the next slide basically how their shell, looks very close to probably what you know as cowries. So the Flamingo Tongue, they feed primarily on soft corals, and they use that hard tongue that I mentioned, that radula, to scrape the polyps off of these soft corals in order to eat them. Now, the reason that I'm mentioning what they eat, and I'll mention this a few times throughout the presentation, is because many times when you're trying to identify different organisms, the best place to find them is around what they eat. So if you know that these flamingo tongues like to eat things like soft corals, things like gorgonians, if you're trying to go out there and find them, you might want to look at what they're eating in order to see if you can find these really beautiful animals. So they're most often found because they have this pretty bright coloration. They tend to be this orange color. Sometimes they're quite pink, and they have these really cool patterns on it that almost looks like the skin of a giraffe. Now, similar to true cowries, these false cowries or flamingo tongues, they cover their shell with their fleshy mantle. So you can see here, this is just the shell of the animal. Whenever they're scared, they can actually remove the mantle from the outside, and they go inside of the shell to hide. And then when everything seems to be okay again, they can push themselves back out, cover the shell once again, and then they will look like that flamingo tongue that we all know and love. Now, these shells are also really common. You can find them pretty commonly on the beaches. You can also find them in tourist shops, but I definitely don't advocate for actually buying any of them. But I think it's really fun to go out there, try to find the shells at least, and then maybe if you're out there in the water, take a look at wherever you can find soft corals and see if you can find any of these flamingo tongues eating away at the kind of really beautiful things like gorgonians. As you can see by the dime there, these are very, very small animals, and I personally find it really fun to find those really small animals, just because it always feels like you really earn something, right? When you're trying to find that tiny, tiny little thing, especially when they're as beautiful as these wonderful flamingo tongues. So the next that I have for you is actually a whole genus, and it's called Aplysia. These are your sea hares. Now, I think they're called sea hares because they've got some of these appendages in the front that I guess kind of look like ears. And we might return a few times to the fact that we have named things in kind of silly ways through time, but these names stick, and I still kind of love sea hares. Now, what these are in the front, kind of these longer looking ear things, these are those eye stalks. So again, thinking about how a lot of these animals do have a visual system. So they have a very rudimentary visual system. It's not great. They can see the basic things like shapes and maybe some colors, if not just shading. But one of the really, really, really cool things about these and some of the other related animals are actually these appendages up here that are called rhinopores. These rhinopores are chemosensory organs, meaning that instead of using them to hear or to see, they can actually sense chemicals in the water. And they use these chemical signals to basically learn what's around in their environment, be it predators or the things that they're trying to eat. Like the cephalopods we'll talk about later, they do have a soft internal shell. And unlike many of the cephalopods, though, these are herbivores. So these herbivores, they can range in size from just a few centimeters to about the size of a football. However, here in Florida, we don't really get the football-shaped or sized ones. Most of those you'll find over on the west coast of the United States. So here they tend to be a bit smaller. However, even when they're not huge, they are really cool. And my two favorite features about sea hares is that despite being primarily benthic animals, so benthic means that they live on the bottom or the benthos. So despite being benthic animals, they can actually swim. They use these weird little flappy things that they have on their side. They basically undulate them up and down, and they can lift off of the benthos and swim away. Now, they're not very strong swimmers. They don't really have a great sense of where they're going, but it's really cool to see what these kind of like snaily looking things can do, where anytime they're kind of disturbed or they're looking for a new place to eat, anything like that, they can flap away and you'll see them kind of swim off into the distance. Now, the other really cool thing is they can ink. Now, oftentimes their discharges are kind of the more purplish colors, but some of them that we have here release this really iridescent hot pink. And I know it's kind of a freaky display and it looks like it's super toxic, but it's actually not harmful at all to you. But it is super, super, super cool to see. And they tend to ink when they get disturbed. Please don't disturb them on purpose. But if you happen to be out there during a day that's, I don't know, a little bit, wavy or anything like that, you can sometimes see these really, really cool displays of these sea hares, either swimming away to better pastures or otherwise inking to try to, hide themselves. Hopefully, if you guys see these out there, you'll be able to see some of these really, really, really awesome displays. All right, so moving on from some of the larger of these sluggy-looking things, we've got the Nudibranchs. So this is the first thing. I'll ask you guys to drop some of your guesses in the chat. What do you think nudibranch means? And I'll give you a little hint. Look at nudi and look at bronch. Can you guys guess what nudibranch means? Just drop your answers in the question box. And Rachel, can you let me know some of the answers we're getting?
No answers yet. Oh, naked branches.
Okay, quite close. Any other guesses?
Naked gills.
Oh, right. Yeah, exactly. So nudibranch means naked lung. Nudi, naked, bronch, lung. And basically they get their name from the exposed gills that you can see on these photos on the left. So in both of these cases, these things that look like crowns on the back are actually the gills of this animal. It's what they use to pull oxygen out of the water in order to basically respirate. Now, up here in the front, we have those chemosensory organs, the rhinopores that we just saw on the sea hares as well. And so again, you can think about how, we organize these animals because of those common features. It's much more likely that these similar rhinopores came from common ancestors that also had rhinopores. Now, the two photos that we have on the right, these are also nudibranchs, but actually they don't have exposed gills. They do their sort of respiration just with gas exchange that goes through their tissue. So it's a little bit of a misnomer for them, but they are still categorized as nudibranchs. So all of these things that you see on their body, however, these are called serrata, and they serve different kinds of functions, but they're not true lungs. Sometimes they're used for defense. Sometimes they're used to just kind of show off different coloration in a way of probably telling predators, oh, we're dangerous, don't mess with us. So one of the cool things about nudibranchs, and one of the things that we use to separate them from other sea slugs, is that they are carnivorous. So they'll eat things like sponges, other sea slugs, they will eat eggs of various animals. And one of the really, really awesome things about nudibranchs is that some of them feed on things like hydroids or jellyfish, and they can actually take the stinging cells of those organisms and incorporate them into their own tissue or into their serrata and use them as defense mechanisms. So basically what they're doing is they're taking what was the defense of the thing that they're eating and incorporating it into their own body in order to defend themselves from other predators. And I just think that sort of thing is fascinating. I mean, I would love to be able to do that with the things that I eat, but it's really one of the things that I think are truly, truly, truly fascinating about nudibranchs. So some of the common names of these organisms. On the top left, you have the regal sea goddess, and on the bottom left, you have Olga's sea goddess. And you can remember these goddesses, as we call them, I think, because they have the crowns on the back. And then over on the right, we have a species of Flavelina, and this one on the bottom right, we call the crisscross Tritonia. The crisscross you can see because of this patterning that they have along their mantle. Remember that fleshy part. Now, many times we commonly call any old sea slugs nudibranchs. However, there are other sea slugs that are not technically nudibranchs, and in large part it's because these are all herbivores. Now, it's totally fine if you go out and see one of these and just call them a nudibranch. Most people do, but if we're going to be a little bit technical about it, these are technically not nudibranchs because they are not carnivores, but they are still closely related. So on the left, we have the painted Elysia, and on the right, we have the lettuce sea slug. I know it's a little bit hard to tell, but this painted Elysia on the side, I mean, this is really, really teeny tiny. This could probably fit on one of your fingernails very comfortably. And in fact, a lot of nudibranchs and sea slugs are quite small. And so again, they can be really, really fun to find, not just because they're beautiful and cool and awesomely colored, but also because they're teeny tiny and it just feels awesome when you're able to find one. What's something that's really cool about the lettuce sea slug is that you see all these folds on the back where it gets its lettuce name. They can actually grow these to be so big and so bushy that you can't see the rest of the mantle. It really is just covered by all these folds on top. And so sometimes you'll be sitting around you know, and just see this thing that you think is algae, and then it starts like moving away from you, only to realize, oh my goodness, this is actually a sea slug that is just trying to look like algae. One other thing is that that's cool about some of these sea slugs is just like the nudibranchs, if any of these are feeding on toxic algae, many of them can actually incorporate those toxins into their own tissue and again, kind of use that as defense against anything that's trying to eat them. And again, one of the reasons that I like to say that these guys are herbivores is because if you're specifically trying to look for these sea slugs, if you ever make it to a little patch of, say, turf algae or an area where there's a lot of algae, well, maybe you can take a look and see if you can find this like really beautiful, say, red coloration of the folds on top, or this really bushy lettuce kind of sea slug looking guy. Basically look at what they're eating to try to find them. All right, I also want to note there are likely thousands and thousands of species of sea slugs and nudibranchs in Florida alone. There's no way to cover them all in a single presentation, but always keep a lookout for these because they are very, very cool and they're always fun to point out to others. So now going from the small to the large, we have the queen conch. This is one of the best known gastropods that are out there. Many times they're known for their really, really substantial and cool shells. However, these are quite large animals. They're slow-moving snails. They can live a long time, say up to 40 years. And just like those other sea slugs that we just mentioned, these are herbivores. They live primarily in shallow seagrass beds, and they basically scoot around these seagrass beds looking for algae and other aquatic plants to dine on. Now, despite the very substantial shell of especially the adult queen conchs, they have a ton of predators. So they are preyed upon by things like sea stars, eagle rays, nurse sharks, even loggerhead turtles, lots of different kinds of fish, and of course, humans. So the queen conch has become a very important food item throughout the Caribbean, and it's been an important food source for a very long time. In addition to that, their shells have been used for everything from making primitive tools to actual decorations, and they've been used pretty extensively in ceremonies. So I really do like to note that they are important not just kind of to Floridians, but to folks throughout the Caribbean because their populations are not in a great place. And in fact, their harvest is illegal here in Florida to try to protect their populations. But needless to say, I think they are kind of worth our protection, not just because they're so cool to see out in the environment, but also because of their import to lots of cultures kind of historically throughout the Caribbean. So moving on to the cephalopods. So cephalopod comes from the two Greek words that roughly translates to head, feet. And I think the reason that they're called that is because, again, early taxonomists took a look and they're like, oh, look, this has a head and some feet. So we're going to call them head feet. But anyway, the Caribbean reef squid is the only species of squid that we commonly find along Florida's coral reef. So odds are if you see a squid, you are looking at this common Caribbean reef squid. Now, you do see them pretty frequently. Many times you see them in schools, and so they're pretty easy from a distance to confuse with fish. But I think once you get kind of closer and see their head, feet, you can tell pretty quickly, oh, I'm looking at a squid. Oh, because I'm in Florida, this is probably the Caribbean reef squid. They are generally about half a foot to a foot long. And that's basically when they're outstretched like this, the largest you'll see them is probably about a foot long. They're not really substantial animals, but you can find them pretty commonly. They also have these two pretty substantial, for squid at least, fins on the side, and they tend to have this darker rim right along the fins that they have. Now, their color varies, and both of these pictures I think are taken at night because at nighttime they tend to be these really beautiful iridescent colors. You can sometimes see them as pink, but most oftentimes it's kind of more of this like brownish, orangish coloration. But they do have these really bright spots of iridescence all along them. And so especially when they catch something like the moonlight or the light from your torch, it's almost magical how almost glowing they are. Oftentimes, if they're disturbed by either you or something else in the environment, they will turn much paler than what you see here. But they will start to lift their feet or their tentacles like this. And in this photo on the left, it's basically their way of protecting, trying to look scary, even though I think it kind of looks cute. But anyway, they can be this really gold color. They're really cool to see at night. And during the day, if you see them, they tend to be quite darker. So as you can see, they can change their colors pretty dramatically, and that's pretty common with cephalopods, generally speaking. It is thought that they can use these color changes, including really rapid color changes, to communicate with other squid. And I guess they are able to communicate, very complex things to each other because they have lots of different ways of kind of changing their appearance. Now, if you're taking a look at these photos and you're like, wow, this doesn't quite look like a squid, we completely understand. These are much less like slim or streamlined than many squid that we know, and oftentimes they're confused with their cousin, the cuttlefish. However, we don't have any cuttlefish, at least that we know of, that live here in Florida's coral reefs. So if you see something and you think it's a cuttlefish, odds are it's actually like this common Caribbean reef squid. So next up, we have the common octopus, or the Octopus vulgaris. It's called the common octopus because it's found literally worldwide. You can find these in tropical oceans, subtropical oceans, and even temperate waters. You can find them super near to the surface or all the way down to 500 feet. And I swear to God, if they could figure out how to breathe air, they would be up here with us too, probably trying to take over. However, due to their really wide distribution, there are many folks who think that perhaps we are describing multiple species or even subspecies as just this general Octopus vulgaris. But until someone, I think, breaks it down further, we're just going to keep calling them the common octopus. Now, when stretched out from basically the tip of their arm to the mantle, so if you can think when they're swimming more looking like this squid, they can be about 3 feet long, which is, seems kind of big, but most of the times when you see them, they're not stretched out like that. They're going to be walking around the benthos, remember the bottom? They'll be walking around the benthos looking like this. They're maybe about the size of a soccer ball. They are not very long-lived. They usually live about 2 years old, and they will die after they reproduce for the first and only time in their life. But interestingly, this kind of life pattern that they have, their strategy for reproduction is very good. And so they have really robust populations, even in places where they're targeted as kind of a fisheries species. Now, you might recall when I was talking about mollusks in general, how I talked about the organization of a nervous system. Well, one of the amazing things about the octopus, and including the common octopus, is that they have a full complex nervous system. So they have a central brain just like you and I, but about 2/3 of the neurons that they have are actually in their arms. And in fact, at the base of each of these arms, they have these nerve bundles, these really dense nerve bundles that are not a true brain, but really do resemble a brain and kind of how dense those neurons are. And what this allows the octopus to do is actually to manipulate their arms independent of having to communicate back with the central brain. So the way that you and I function, if we want to do basically anything, it has to go through the brain. We have to go all the way back up to the top, and say, hey, I want to wave my arm around before you can start waving your arm around. But these octopuses don't have to do that. They can send basically electrical signals from those dense nerve bundles in their arm without having to communicate back with the central brain, which is absolutely fascinating. Now, as you can see in these photos, but also in this awesome photo, they can change their appearance pretty drastically, not just in their coloration, but also in the texture of their skin. So most of the times that you see these octopuses, they're going to have this kind of warty appearance on their mantle here, like you can see in these fighting octopuses. However, as you can see in some of these photos, they can also basically fully smooth it out or have little spikes around it. But it's really cool to see, especially when you see multiple octopuses, how they are basically the same animal, but can look drastically different. Now, during the daytime, they tend to be kind of darker colors. Oftentimes, it's like a reddish brownish color. When they're disturbed, just like the squid, they tend to have these paler colors. They are also nocturnal animals, and so most of the times that you see them will be if you're night diving or night snorkeling. However, during the day, one of the really great ways to find them is to look out for their dens. So during the day, they tend to live in crevices or dens, and at nighttime when they hunt, they'll go out and they'll find their food, and they'll actually bring it back to the dens. And they tend to eat things like bivalves, so things like clams or mussels, as well as different crustaceans like crabs. And so oftentimes if you're swimming around and you see a kind of pile of shells or a pile of shells with some, carapaces of different crustaceans, if you start to poke around and find where that opening is, you can definitely see an octopus hanging out in there. And oftentimes they'll just kind of be staring out at you wondering, what is this crazy person doing looking at me? But I always think it's really exciting to, poke around the crevices and see if you can see one of these brilliant, really, really, really smart animals looking back at you. One of the reasons that I like to include this photo is because octopuses are pretty territorial animals to other octopuses. They're not going to bother you. They're much more scared of you than you should be of them. But if you ever see two octopuses interact, it is super hard to tell when they are loving each other or hating each other, because the way that they fight and the way that they reproduce are very eerily similar. And I've seen this in person, both with the common octopus, but also several other species of octopus. And it's just always funny to see and to think, like, are you guys enjoying yourselves, or is this an actual territorial fight? So the last thing that I want to mention about the octopus, and this is getting back to some of that evolutionary theory that we shared towards the beginning, is that octopuses have a very complex visual system as well as a very complex nervous system. But very interestingly, there is a line of thought that actually they developed this visual system independent from other organisms. And what's fascinating about that is it's one thing for, like a similar body plan to develop, but a visual system is extremely complex. And to see that there are multiple lineages of the evolution of this visual system tells you, number one, that this was a huge turning point in evolution, in that most of the animals that have predominated the world, at least in modern history, have had a visual system because it gave such an amazing advantage to other animals. But it also raises the question is, how the heck did these octopuses like over-engineer their whole body? Not just that they can change their shape, not just that they can change their color, but they actually independently evolved a visual system. And there are plenty of people that work in the ocean that are convinced that these guys are aliens, but they are just such fascinating animals. And I would say if there's one thing you can take away at it, is that you really need to respect these guys, because if they can figure out a way to get on land, oh, they will. All right, and the last animal in this phylum that I have for you is the bay scallop. Now, this is cheating a little bit because these actually live in seagrass beds that are usually, adjacent or nearby coral reefs, but you probably won't find a bay scallop directly on the reef itself. But these are absolutely lovely little animals. As you can see, one of the coolest things about them is that they have these little iridescent blue eyes. So they also have a very rudimentary visual system. They can basically see shades. And so if you're swimming by and you see one of these, usually if you wave your hand over them, that will cause them to close up. But as I mentioned, these guys live in seagrass beds in nearshore waters. And really the distinguishing feature are these electric blue eyes that they have. One of the really awesome things, just like those sea hares that I love, is that these can swim. So they can open and close their shell really rapidly and use that as a form of locomotion. So it's really fun, I think, if you're ever kind of snorkeling or swimming around seagrass beds, to see if these guys can bop around. And while these were once quite common here in Southeast Florida, unfortunately, they are much harder to come by these days. We think it's due to pollution or the really intense urban development that we have in South Florida, probably as well as some habitat loss like seagrass bed loss. However, there are still some pockets with pretty robust populations, especially along Florida's west coast. And summertime scalloping is still a pretty popular outing. So if ever you're over there during summertime, maybe try to find areas where they have robust population, and it's a really fun thing you can do with your family. And then you have also you've got to say it, a delicious meal at the end of the activity, if you choose to keep them. All right, so I'll pause there before we move on to the annelids and ask, are there any quick questions on our mollusks?
Maurizio, we had a question that I had answered about whether sea slugs could incorporate photosynthetic algae. And I mentioned the species off the US West Coast, sorry, I said East Coast in the answer, Elysia chlorotica. I probably pronounced that terribly, that does incorporate chloroplast into its cell and thus photosynthesizes.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating thing that these animals are able to do that, kind of, not just with a single type of, say, cell or toxin, but that they're able to kind of do it with multiple ones. It's really, really incredible. I wish I could do that.
It would be incredible.
All right, awesome. In that case, I'll move us on to the segmented worms. So annelids, segmented worms, they are a similarly kind of diverse phylum. You can find these in marine freshwater and even pretty moist terrestrial systems. And the reason I mentioned the moist terrestrial systems is you can think that common earthworm does fall into this category. It is a segmented worm. Now, most marine annelids are in a group that are called polychaetes. Poly meaning many, and chaetes meaning bristles. And they also live in a pretty diverse range of marine habitats, all the way from those frigid polar seas all the way down to those extreme hypothermal vents. So, those vents that are way down at the bottom of the ocean where they basically the heat from the middle of the earth kind of spills out into the ocean. It makes the water super hot. It's super pressurized down there, but you can find polychaetes there as well as in our coral reefs. And you can find them in many, 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 if not all, marine ecosystems. And if my slides would advance, I will start you with the bearded fireworm. So this again is one of those polychaetes, and you can maybe guess why it's called those many bristled organisms, kind of many bristled worms, by all of these bristles that you see along the side. I guess people thought that this part at the front maybe looked like a beard, but either way, when you see these, you can think, oh, it's a polychaete because it has many, many bristles throughout. So these are found pretty commonly throughout reef areas, and when they are disturbed, they will kind of display and sort of push out their bristles. And if you might be looking at this and thinking, oof, that looks a little dangerous, it's because it is. So those bristles are able to puncture your skin, and they can inject a little toxin in there that will basically create a little burning rash. It's probably not going to do much worse than that, but I can tell you from personal experience, it is not very pleasant. And so definitely keep an eye out for this. I mean, the general rule for marine organisms is don't touch it. Don't bother it and it won't bother you, but especially in some of these cases, and I'll try to point out where, really try not to touch these guys. So as you can see in these photos, the bearded fireworm has a pretty strong appetite for corals. They are pretty voracious predators, and they can munch away pretty significant patches of corals in a single meal, including some of the threatened corals that we have here in Florida. Now, they are traditionally primarily nocturnal animals, but for various reasons, we're increasingly seeing them pretty active during the daytime here in Florida. And we're not sure if that's because of food shortages, like there are fewer corals than there once were. Maybe there's increased competition because of a lack of predators that they have. We're really not sure. But it is really interesting just to note that there's kind of a changing pattern of these animals that have been noticed in the past few decades. And it's probably an interesting question to figure out why. Now, because I'm a coral disease guy, I also have to mention we have been seeing these animals, these fireworms, predating on diseased corals. And there are some studies that have shown that these worms can actually be both a vector and a reservoir of coral disease pathogens, which means if they're munching on a diseased coral, then they can go over to a healthy coral and start eating on that and actually transmit the disease to those corals. And the second animal that I have for you today is the Christmas tree worm. And so thinking back to that question of Nudibranch, can anyone guess what Spirobronchus might mean? I can drop any guesses down in the chat, or sorry, the question box.
Spiral lungs.
You got it. So yes, you got the spiro for spiral and bronchus for gills or lungs. So what you see right here, kind of this exposed part of the animal, those are in fact its gills. And as with several other marine organisms, especially or primarily all of these filter feeders, these gills play a dual role where they help with respiration. So they're able to pull that oxygen out of the water, but they also use them for feeding. So basically what they do is they will try to catch any passing organic material, and when they catch something in these gills, they will retract down into kind of this little tube that they've created, like you see here on the left-hand photo, where they'll be able to move that food down to where it can digest, and then they'll put their gills back out to continue to breathe and to continue to eat. Now, this is also a polychaete worm, even though it kind of doesn't look like what you might think of a mini bristled animal. But the segmented part of their body is actually down within the coral. It lives inside these tubes. Now, these are animals that are very sensitive to kind of changes in the water and the light around them. And so anytime that you're diving near these, if you see them, if you just wave your hand near them, they're going to retract really quickly into the coral, into the tube that's buried within this coral, and then they will slowly start to emerge again and kind of show their full coloration and their full splendor. And I think it's really fun. It doesn't really bother the animal because they do this all day, all the time. But it can be really fun if you're kind of, going by a coral and you see all these Christmas tree worms out there. If you, brush your hand past them, you can see them go up and down. It's just a fun way to pass the time if you're hanging out with corals. And so kind of thinking about, where these live, if you can find these bouldering corals, many times you'll be able to find these really brightly colored, beautiful, fun to interact with Christmas tree worms. All right, so those are the only annelids I have for you today. And so I can pause for more questions if anyone has them, and we can return to mollusk questions as well. But otherwise, we can scoot along to our arthropods.
We do have 2 questions about fireworms. So the first question is, what are some predators of fireworms?
So there are several species of fish that eat fireworms. I am not a fish guy, and so I don't know the species names themselves, but basically if there are predatory fish that are, what's the word? They're not opportunistic, but if they eat a wide variety of things, basically, then potentially they could be feeding on fireworms. So I know there are certain kinds of groupers that have eaten them, certain kinds of, I think, grunts. But yeah, I think primarily fish would be their predators, as far as I know.
And then Kevin Reed, sorry, you had raised your hand previously and I hadn't seen it pop up. So you may have had a question about our previous phylum. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, please go ahead. I've unmuted you on my end.
I'm okay.
Okay.
I don't need to ask a question.
Awesome. So then we do have one more question. So if someone wanted to know that if they did see a fireworm, should they squish it when they see one or just leave it be?
Thanks for asking. Definitely just leave it be. They're not at the point where we're considering any sort of control for them. It is important to note that predators are an important part of any ecosystem. And so it is actually good to know that there are still coral predators out there, because it does mean that there is probably enough coral, at least at the moment, to sustain, the other species that might be feeding on them. So thank you for the offer, but please let them be, let them do their munching. But we'll let you know if at any point we change our mind.
And that's it for the questions.
All right, awesome. So in that case, I will move us on to another one of the very, very highly diverse phylums, and that's Arthropoda. So remember when I mentioned that the largest class of organisms that we have are the insects? So that is housed within arthropods. And in large part due to just how many insects there are and how many have been described, about 80% of all described species are arthropods. And most of those are terrestrial. Now, this is probably in part due to the fact that there are so many insects out there, but also early taxonomists and early biologists were like obsessed with insects and especially obsessed with beetles. And so a truly shocking number of described animals are actually beetles. So it's a little bit because we've sort of put more effort into naming these species, but also it has to be noted this is a very diverse, very, very diverse phylum. Now, what unites all of these animals, right? Thinking about those common traits. So all arthropods have an exoskeleton, so a hard outside of their body. They have these paired jointed appendages like legs. And most of them, the way that they actually grow is they have to shed that full exoskeleton, which also covers those jointed legs. They basically get rid of that exoskeleton, then they'll grow and form a new one. And the reason I like to mention that, this is a process called molting, you may have heard of before, is that many times people will find, the exoskeleton of the animal and think, oh no, why did this, crab or lobster or whatever die? And it actually didn't, it was just in the process of growing. So if I can advance my slides, the largest subphylum of marine arthropods that we have are the crustaceans, or as they're called, the crustbearers. So these include a lot of the small ocean critters that I absolutely adore. Things like your brine shrimp and your ostracods and your copepods. I like to call these as like the little zoomies. So if any of y'all like to do night diving or night snorkeling, if you bring your torch with you, you ever notice when you're holding it out there and you see all those tiny little things zooming around? Many times what those are tiny crustaceans. They might be basically the larvae of some of these larger ones on the right, but many times they are the full-grown version of things like brine shrimp or copepods. They are really, really fascinating animals. They have an amazing diversity in terms of their body plans, and the just general diversity of the animals is incredible. But despite my personal love for these animals, we're not going to talk about them today because people get much more excited about the bigger ones that they can see more normally. So we have the Malacostraka, and these are the largest class of crustaceans, containing about 40,000 species of things like shrimp and crabs and lobsters, mantis shrimp, krill, crayfish, and much, much more. Now, the unifying feature of these animals is that they have a segmented body plan that includes a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. And almost all of these are also organized according to what we call bilateral symmetry, which basically means if you cut this animal in half, its left side and its right side are going to look exactly the same. And so again, you can see that same basic body plan where you have the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. With crabs, it's a little bit harder to tell, but you have their head right up here, the thorax is in the back, and then the abdomen is underneath. But that's really the unifying feature of these Malacostraka. The first one that I want to share with you is one of my favorite to find on the reef, and that's the banded coral shrimp, which is also sometimes called the barber pole shrimp because of the red and white coloration that you see throughout its body. Now, most of the kind of clear red and white coloration is on the really large front forceps or front claws that they have, but even across their iridescent bodies, you can see, that banded coloration of alternating red and white. Now, these are pretty small. The largest that you'll find them is maybe 10 centimeters from the head to the end of their body. However, the way that it's you can most easily spot them is they have these really, really, really long antennae. And these are sometimes, twice as long as the body themselves. And so if ever you're trying to find these, the best way, in my opinion, to be able to spot them is to take a look for these really long, bright white antennae. And oftentimes at the end of the antenna, you'll find something like a very cool banded coral shrimp. What they have is kind of these two large forceps in the front, and you can see they have these little spines on them that are used for defense. What's very cool about these and many other crustaceans is that they can remove and then regrow their limbs. So basically, if they have a predator that's coming by, sometimes what they'll do is they will just pop off an arm and basically hand it to the fish. And while the fish or whatever's trying to eat them is busy with that, they will scoot away. And then later on, they can regenerate those claws. And so many times when you take a look at these animals, these are not great examples, but you will actually see that they have two different sized claws. And the reason likely is that they kind of gave one up or were attacked by a predator. And actually, I think on this example, this guy or lady on the right, they probably have already lost their other claw, and they've just got the one, and so the other will be in the process of regrowing. These are, in fact, cleaner shrimp. And so many times what you can do is if you're going to the same spot over and over again, you can commonly find them just hanging out there, because what they do is they will set up shop and other fish or organisms will know that that's where they go to get cleaned. However, sometimes also if there is, say, like a resident eel, they will set up shop by that eel because it is always a meal that they have ready to go. So basically the agreement, the implicit agreement they have is that they will clean these animals if these animals don't eat them. And so it's a beneficial relationship because they will clean parasites and other little buggies off of these animals and exchange, they get a meal and then they don't get eaten themselves. And interestingly, you tend to notice these two quite large claws in front, but they have a second pair of little forceps here, and that's actually what they use for their cleaning. And so if you zoom in, you can actually start to see those, and I think I added little arrows here. So it's the second forceps down here that they actually use to clean. And I always like to say, if you're looking for something to do when you're hanging out with a banded coral shrimp, you can just stick your hand out to them and they might start cleaning your hand. There are plenty of divers who also try to go up there kind of close to these shrimp and open their mouths. And I've never seen it, but I've definitely seen videos of folks having these little shrimp come in and give them a little bit of dental work. It's not going to harm you, and kind of once you need to close your mouth, they'll know to pop away. But it's really fun to I think, get a little clean, maybe get a little manicure from these shrimpies. There's another kind of cleaner shrimp that I really love to find, and it's called the Peterson cleaner shrimp. The reason that I love these is because they are this mostly translucent body, but with this beautiful, beautiful iridescent purple kind of all up and down the length of their body. And similar to some of those Nudibranchs that I mentioned, they're pretty small and, can be kind of tough to find. Just like the banded coral shrimp, I tend to look for the antenna and then see what's at the end of the antenna. but it's also just really fun to find them because they can be really hard to spot because of how iridescent they are. Now, sometimes one other way to spot them is when the females are pregnant, they have a series of really bright pink eggs. And so sometimes funny, to see this shrimp and everyone's like, oh, cool, it's like their normal pink coloration. You have to tell them, nope, actually, it's just the eggs that they have inside of their translucent body. You are seeing right through their body to those eggs. Now, they also tend to live in association with a few different kinds of anemones, including this corkscrew anemone like you see in this left-hand photo. And again, I mentioned this because if you're ever trying to find these shrimps specifically, you might look for the anemones that they associate with, or fish that seem to be, like hanging around anemones because maybe they're just sitting around getting cleaned. What's cool is you can kind of watch them as the anemones and they sway in the current. It's just a kind of nice thing to, hang out and take a break during their dives. And these two are pretty unafraid of divers. So if ever you're trying to get a little manicure, you can stick your fingers out and many times it will come and give you a little manicure. Now, as I mentioned, these can be pretty tough to see. So I like to include this photo. Can anyone spot the Peterson cleaner shrimp here?
Yeah, there's the antennae.
Yep, indeed, there are the antennae. So right there, right in the middle, you can see the little shrimp. And potentially, I don't know how large your screens are, but you might be able to see that really beautiful iridescent purple. So once again, going from the small to the big, you cannot have any sort of webinar about marine invertebrates in South Florida without talking about the Caribbean spiny lobster. So these crustaceans are some of the most important ones that we have in Florida, not just for their ecological value, but also, as you probably know, for their economic value. But the way that you can spot these is they tend to have these pretty kind of normal lobster-looking elongated bodies. However, they have these two really large spines in the front that sometimes can be twice as long as their body. So again, just like those cleaner shrimp, if you're trying to spot these guys, sometimes you'll just need to spot these kind of long horns sticking out the front. And once you kind of look within crevices, then you'll be able to find them. So these are primarily nocturnal animals, as several of the others are. And so during the day, if you're out there snorkeling or diving, you'll really have to poke your head around little crevices, look under rocks or large corals, and you may be able to find them. And so that's also to say when you are, snorkeling or diving in an area, if you do see, pretty substantial rock, figures or really substantial corals, I would definitely say try to take a look underneath and see if you can spot any of these lobsters. At night, though, if you're doing any night diving or night snorkeling, they tend to come out and they are pretty active, so you can find them pretty easily, kind of walking around, scavenging. They feed a lot on mollusks as well, but they are also known to scavenge on anything that they can find along the bottom. So unlike their cousins further to the north, like the Maine lobster, the Caribbean spiny lobster lacks those really large front claws. But despite lacking those claws that people really love to crack open and eat, these are also an extremely popular animal for human consumption. And in fact, it might be the most important food export that we have here in the Florida Keys, at least, as well as places like the Bahamas. And they are sought, not just by commercial fishermen selling them, but also by amateur and recreational lobstermen and lobsterwomen who are kind of, out there looking for a delicious meal. And we don't really have good stock numbers available, so we don't really know with hard numbers what their population looks like. However, Florida is really protective of this animal because of how important it is. And so they do close the harvest usually from about April to July in order to protect these animals during mating season. And then we have something called the lobster mini season, which is right after this mating season. They kind of open it up, and there tends to be a lot of folks who come down and fish for these lobsters. But needless to say, I would say if you're interested in lobstering, make sure that you check kind of the time of year and local regulations to make sure that you're not illegally harvesting these, especially because they also have things like size limits and the number that you can take home with you. All right. And next up, we have what I think are some of the creepiest animals that I'm going to share today. And so I wanted to warn you before I start showing these photos. They are a little bit eerie. There have been some horror movies made about these guys, but I absolutely adore isopods. So isopods are also crustaceans. They have basically all have this body plan that you can see here, where they have these overlapping basically panels on them. And at the end of their quite ovular body plan, they have a fin or a tail that kind of radiates at the end. So you have this example as well. You have these overlapping little plates and then a tail at the end. So the isopods that you see here that I'm sharing about today are all parasites. but not all isopods are. There are plenty of isopods that do things like are detritivores. And so what that means, detritus is basically organic material that has fallen to the seafloor. So you can think when like a fish loses some of its scales, or it excretes something, that's organic matter that's going to fall to the bottom. And a really important kind of role in an ecosystem is going to be the janitor of the reef. So who's going to go down there and eat all of that organic material that's at the bottom? So there are plenty of isopods that do that. There are plenty that are free moving, free swimming, all of that stuff. But what these isopods are parasitic. And so as juveniles, they do swim around. But what they're doing is they're swimming around is trying to find a suitable host. And once they find a suitable host, they will attach to it, like these 4 fish that you see here, and they will stay there for life. And in many cases, these isopods actually lose their ability to swim or move on their own, and instead use whatever's on the bottom of their body to fully attach and sometimes even fuse to their hosts. And what they're doing in these 2 cases is that they're positioning themselves close to the front of the fish because they're going to be feeding on the specks of food that kind of fly off as the fish are eating. So fish are not particularly elegant eaters. And so oftentimes, as they're eating, bits and pieces of whatever they're eating floats, all around them. And so what these isopods are doing is they're actually trying to eat all of the things that the fish is kind of spewing everywhere. And so now for the truly creepy part is that some isopods are not content with just being close to the mouth. Some of them are actually going to go into the mouth. And so what these isopods do is as they're juveniles, they enter the fish either through the mouth or through the gills. They eat away the tongue and then they replace the tongue. And the idea here is that they don't have to really wait for the fish to be a messy eater. They can eat whatever is going directly into that fish's mouth. And they can be so successful that they grow too large and they can actually inhibit the host's ability to eat and lead to the demise not just of their host, but eventually to themselves as well. Okay, we're done with the creepy picture, but oopsies, way too fast there. I just really like to emphasize how cool I think these animals are, how interesting it is that they have such a diverse range of behaviors, different, styles of their life, but it's really cool, I think, if you're ever fishing or looking around fish, if you see something that has this weird attachment to it, you might be looking at a parasitic isopod. What's also cool about these animals is that oftentimes they have what we call sexual dimorphism, which basically means that there are pretty substantial differences between how the males and the females appear. So you can think of peacocks. I think that's the classic example of sexual dimorphism, where the males have that really distinct, very flamboyant plumage, while the females do not. And so in the case of at least parasitic isopods, their sexual dimorphism is that the females are far, far, far larger than the males. And so it's a safe bet that the ones that you see pictured here or in the mouth are actually the females. And odds are, if you're able to spot these, what you're looking at are the females. And bonus points if anyone can name either of the fish that are here, either from the fish ID course or if you know them. If you want to drop any of your guesses in the question box. I hope it's not illegal to talk about vertebrates in this invert class.
One answer was a squirrelfish.
Yeah, nice. So on the left, you have the black bar squirrelfish, and on the right is a fish called the gravesby. Kind of looks like a grouper. All right, so I'm going to move us on into our last phylum, unless there are any questions about arthropods.
We do have 2 questions. One is, might be a bit of a, anyways, is it an environmental factor that the Caribbean spiny lobster does not have claws that Maine lobsters do?
Oh, that's an excellent question, and I do not have an answer for you. Yeah, I don't know. Nothing jumps to mind as an environmental factor.
Email it to coral@floridadp.gov, and I can look into the difference between the species if you'd like to do that.
Yeah, a great question.
Yes, and then the second question is regarding isopods. Lots of videos of people removing them. Do you recommend removing isopods?
I mean, so just like with the bearded fireworms, parasites are actually a sign of a healthy ecosystem in most cases. Unless they're parasites everywhere, then maybe it's a consideration, but not necessarily. So sometimes, especially in cases like on the right here, like you see how fused it is to the fish. If you remove this, there's going to be an open lesion here that would be then open to things like infection. And so it might actually not be great for the fish to basically give it an open wound. On the other hand, yeah, maybe. Definitely if you're planning to eat the fish, remove the parasites. Take a look in the mouth along the body plan, but also in the gills. Sometimes you can also find them in the flesh. And for the most part, if you can see the isopod and you remove it, it's totally fine to eat that fish. But I would say if you're doing a catch and release, it's not necessary. If you would like to, kind of up to you. But it's, again, you know, it's a natural and important part of an ecosystem. Yeah, so I guess that's where I personally land at least.
And that's it for our questions.
Awesome, thanks. Cool, and if you guys want to be creeped out even further, look up what's called parasitic castration, where the parasites focus on the reproductive organs of these animals. It's primarily found in crustaceans, at least in the Caribbean. And the only reason I mention that is because if you are kind of fishing for crustaceans, always take a look down where their reproductive area is, which is down on basically the bottom of the animal, remember that thorax is, the abdomen is, to take a look if there are any parasites in there. Okay, so we can move on to the final group that we're going to talk about, and it's the hedgehog-skinned echinoderms. So echinoderms, they basically, most of them, not all, but most of them do have kind of rough or bumpy skin, which is how they get their their Greek name, which basically just means hedgehog and skin. Now, most of them have what we call 5-point radial symmetry. So you might remember that bilateral symmetry that I mentioned with some of those crustaceans. The symmetry that many echinoderms have is actually in 5 different ways. And so you can think of your standard sea star as, you know, that standard 5-point radial symmetry. Now, this is the largest phylum that is exclusively marine, and the vast majority of echinoderms are benthic. So again, they live on the bottom. So if ever you're trying to find these echinoderms, look towards the bottom. Now, one of the really cool things about echinoderms is they have really incredible regenerative capabilities. You know, I mentioned some of those shrimp can tear off their arm and grow a new one. These guys can do that, but like tenfold. And I'll talk towards the end about some of the really, really fascinating regenerative capabilities of sea cucumbers in particular. And one of the reasons that I mention this is because there is a little bit of an urban myth that if you remove arms from echinoderms, they can grow into animals. That is true, but only in very few cases. So in very, very, very few cases, they can, you know, either remove an arm themselves as a way to basically distract a predator, like those, like the shrimp do or crabs do. But for the most part, when an echinoderm loses an arm, that arm is going to die. And so I really don't want folks going out there and basically like tearing a sea star in 5 thinking, oh, I just made 5 new sea stars. You're probably just killing the animal. So please let them be. All right, and so we're going to cover 4 different classes of echinoderms today. I never say these Latin names because I always get them wrong, but they are your sea stars, your brittle stars, your sea urchins and sand dollars, and finally your sea cucumbers, my absolute favorite animals in the ocean. So starting with some of those sea stars, one of the most common ones that you'll find here in Florida's coral reef is the cushion sea star. So the cushion sea star are notable because they're pretty, they've got these pretty like thick and heavy bodies, and they've got these sort of short and stubby arms. And one of the really awesome things about them is they have this pattern of spines, thinking about those hedgehog skin again, their pattern of spines that can be these really, really beautiful geometric kind of shapes. It really helps them stand out, and I think that's basically the way that you can pretty easily find these is both because they're a little kind of short and stubby, but also they have this really cute, beautiful color pattern on the top. They do come in a variety of colors. I don't know why they come in these colors, but you can sometimes find them this really, really deep red. I personally have never seen one like this, but I have seen plenty that are this more yellowish coloration, but with red spines all over them. Now, the adult sea stars, they technically can grow quite large. I think I've heard that they can be about a foot long, basically, if you go along a long axis. I've never quite seen them that large. I tend to see them maybe the size of my hand or a little bit larger, but supposedly they can grow quite large. Now, they are omnivores, which means they eat both animals and plants, but they also eat detritus. and they scavenge. And so you can think of these guys, they're really good to see, especially in places like sand flats and in seagrass beds, because they are eating up that detritus, they are cleaning up the bottom and making it so that nutrients can get cycled back into the environment. But one of the really, really, really cool things about these animals is the way that they eat. So the way that they eat, regardless of what they're eating, it's not an internal process. What they actually do is they take their stomach, basically turn it inside out and engulf whatever it is they're trying to eat, and they digest it outside of their body. And once they're done digesting, then they will pull it back inside their body and then have those nutrients ready to go. And so that's the same if they're eating detritus. You can sometimes see them making a little pile of sand underneath them and then expelling their skeleton. Or if they're eating something like a dead fish on the bottom, you can also see them expel their skeleton and basically externally digest whatever they're eating, which is such a fascinating concept. I love eating, and so I don't want to necessarily be able to do that because I like tasting my food, but I just think it would be such a cool thing to do every now and then. All right, next up we have your reticulated brittle star. So this is not actually your traditional sea star like the cushion sea star. It is in that group that we call the brittle sea stars. But you can see they kind of have a pretty similar body plan where they have this main disc in the middle and then 5 arms that radiate outwards. And so just like the sea stars, they do have this 5-point radial symmetry, but they are much smaller than the cushion sea stars. So generally speaking, you will find them, the diameter of this middle section is maybe like 10 to 15 millimeters, really, really small. And then these arms are a bit longer. And so usually what you'll see first are these arms moving around rather than this radial disc in the middle. They tend to be this brighter coloration, so they're like white or sandy, maybe a little bit brown, and that's because they do live in sandy areas, and it helps them blend in. But if you ever are in a sandy area, you can pretty commonly find these, and it's really cool the way that they move around. So underneath each of these arms, they have thousands and thousands of little tube feet, and they use those tube feet to basically walk around. But what they'll do is, for whatever reason, is they tend to have this almost, one side that they prefer, and they will push forward with that with the rest of their arms kind of behind them. But they're not swimming in any way. They're really using those thousands of tiny tube feet to walk along the bottom. Unlike the cushion sea stars that are omnivores, these are, as far as we know, just herbivores, and so they eat all of the kind of microalgae that grows along kind of among these sandy patches. So they're good to have around, again, because they're sort of cleaning up that sand. Oh, one of the coolest animals in the entirety of the ocean is the giant basket star. So this is actually in that same class as the brittle star that we just saw, but is many, 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 many times larger. And unlike many of those echinoderms, other echinoderms, as you can probably guess just by looking at these photos, is they don't really have that 5-point radial symmetry. They, generally speaking, actually have 8 legs, and those 8 legs are not symmetrical. So during the day, you'll most often find them balled up like this. Many times they will live in things like these rope corals or other soft corals, where they will ball themselves up into a big ball to basically keep themselves away from predators. Now, oftentimes, if people don't know what they're looking at, they actually think this is like a mass of different worms, but really what it is a single giant basket star, but just that's kind of all curled up together. But if you go out at night, what you can find is that they will open themselves up to feed. So what they do is they unfurl their 8 arms into this really, really magnificent display. And they're forming is a giant plankton net. So they will try to catch anything that's swimming or floating by. And when they feel something, they grab onto it, and they will bring that arm into that central radial disc that you see right here, and feed on whatever they just caught. And so actually, if you look at this radial disc, you can probably see how it looks a little bit like that middle part of a brittle star. But again, this is many, many, many times larger. On the reefs, you can maybe find one that has arms that's like a foot or 2 long, which is really substantial, and it's still like absolutely wild to see them fully unfurled. But their deep sea cousins, other kinds of basket stars, they have been found with arms that are over 5 feet long. And even just seeing these quote unquote small ones on the reef are absolutely fascinating. They look like something between a monster and an alien. And it's so beautiful to watch, especially at nighttime as they're feeding, because I don't know, it's very calming to see, I guess, as they like they furl their tentacles back in. But can you imagine seeing one of those massive ones in the deep sea? Like, it is just one of the coolest animals ever, I would say. I've only seen these twice in my life, but both times I was like screaming with glee underwater. So definitely keep an eye out for them. And again, you know, if you're trying to figure out where to look for them, see if you can find them curled up or, you know, displaying their full splendor around soft corals where they tend to live. All right, now one of the most important animals that I'm going to talk to you about today is the long-spined urchin, or the Diadema antillarum. Now these small urchins, they live on coral reefs all throughout the Caribbean. They are, during the day, they tend to hide in little crevices, but you can definitely see them with their long black spikes popping out of those crevices. Sometimes you will see them emerge kind of in the later afternoon to start grazing, and then all nighttime they will be out there grazing. Now, as I mentioned, they have lots and lots of these long, sharp spines. They're usually this jet black color, but sometimes you'll find them kind of closer to like a dark purple color. Sometimes you'll find them grayish or whitish, especially the spines will be that color. But most of these that you'll find are this jet black color. And these spines are about 10 to 12 centimeters long. But as I mentioned, these are sharp. And so you definitely want to be careful around these because they can very easily puncture even your wetsuit that you have. They will puncture your skin and then break off into your, break off into your skin, and then you'll have a nice little painful, urchin, reminder of that you shouldn't touch these animals. So please don't do this. But the reason I say that these are such important animals, and if you'll permit me for a little bit of a conservation sidebar, it's because these serve as lawnmowers of the reef. So you can kind of understand coral reefs as a constant competition between coral and algae. And they're competing for things like space and for light and for nutrients. And unless you have something to control the algae, it's really easy for that algae to overgrow and kill corals. But you need corals to be, remember how I mentioned that coral reefs are like the mega cities of the ocean? The corals are the buildings. The corals are really what makes a coral reef and what makes it such a diverse, amazing ecosystem. And so you have something that is growing over the corals. Unfortunately, you're going to basically go from something like a city to something like a plain. Or a better example might be, you can think of corals as like a rainforest in the ocean, where the corals are those really tall trees. And if you lose all of those trees, like what do you have left? It's a plain. And it's not that a plain can't host any life. It just doesn't really host the same diversity of life or the same quantity of life. And so it's really important to have things on the reef that are controlling that algae that allows the corals to continue to grow and to dominate. And so unfortunately, back in the early or the late 70s and early 80s, there was a really substantial die-off of these Diadema antillarum, of the long-spined urchin, to the tune of about 97% of the urchins in the Caribbean died. We don't really know what caused it. It happened extremely rapidly, but the effects are still seen today in that we have seen really high algal overgrowth throughout Caribbean coral reefs. And one of the reasons that I'm bringing this up today is because, unfortunately, just about a month ago, other jurisdictions throughout the Caribbean started to report the same kind of die-off that we saw just a few decades ago. The population's never really recovered. We still don't know what causes it. And unfortunately, what has happened is that we have lost these lawnmowers of the reef that are keeping that algae in check. And so what I'm going to ask of you all today is that if you go out and you see an urchin like on the left, and especially if you see a group of urchins like that, if you can please submit a report to cfan.net. This is our citizen science monitoring network that we have in Florida. And these reports are going to go directly to the Department of Environmental Protection, and they'll be able to alert managers throughout the state about potentially the arrival of this. So, sorry, take a step back. It hasn't yet arrived again in Florida, but we are very concerned that it will, because we've already seen it proliferate throughout kind of other jurisdictions. But to say, if you're out there, please take a look out for these long-spined urchins. Be very excited when you see one that is happy and healthy, because it's playing a very important role in the ecosystem. But if you see one that seems to be losing its spines and dying, please take a photo, submit it to CFAN, and we will follow up and hopefully be able to track how it's doing. All right, the last urchin that I have for you today, because I like to kind of have the juxtaposition, is the slate pencil urchin. So I know I just talked about how algae is not great. Well, it turns out there's actually some pretty good algae that we have on the reef. And so all this pink coloration that you see both on this benthos over here, but also on these spines, is a kind of algae called crustose coralline algae. And for anyone that has, a coral reef aquarium, for example, you love to see this pink color out there because it's a very important algae that we have on the reef. It's called crustose because it creates a calcium carbonate layer, basically. It can help to like keep a bunch of basically the benthos together. We sometimes call it like the cement of the reef, but it's also important for lots of other organisms to settle, including corals. So oftentimes if you see nice pink patches, you're looking at crustose coralline algae, and you can find these slate pencil urchins kind of hiding. So it's sometimes hard to see them because their spines are the same coloration as the benthos around them, but you can definitely see them because of this kind of fleshy external mantle. Don't touch it even though it looks cool, but it's always nice to see these guys because it's the sign that there is good crustose coralline algae around, which we like to see in a healthy ecosystem. All right, and the final animals that I have for you today are the sea cucumbers, my absolute favorite animals in the ocean. I think that they are criminally underrated. So there are many different species of sea cucumber, including here in Florida. The two that I have for you today, the first one is the unfortunate but maybe fittingly named donkey dung sea cucumber, and on the right we have the tiger tail sea cucumber. Now, they do play an extremely important role in the ecosystem. They are detritivores, so they are the janitors of the reef. Basically what they do is they scoot around sandy areas, they eat up a whole bunch of the sand and the sediment, they will digest away all the organic material that's inside of it, and then spit back out clean sand. So many times if you're enjoying either, sitting on a very clean beach, or if you're snorkeling or swimming or diving out there and you see really clean sand, you can thank things like the sea cucumbers for cleaning that all up for you. Now, the posterior of the animal is called a cloaca, and it is a single hole that is used for respiration, excretion, and in their case, reproduction. And the only reason I'm bringing that up is because there's a really funky, fun Pacific fish species called the pearlfish that associates with sea cucumbers, where basically they use the sea cucumbers as their home. So anytime a predator comes by, they will actually swim inside that cloaca, swim inside the sea cucumber, and use it for protection. And so if you want to see something funky, definitely go to YouTube and check out some videos of that. It's really funny to see, but also a really cool, I would say, evolution of how these animals work together. And remember how I said towards the beginning of this group that these animals have really amazing regenerative capabilities? So sea cucumbers especially are known for having really, really incredible regenerative capabilities, such that they can expel, or as we call eviscerate, their internal organs, so primarily their digestive tract, either from their mouth or the cloaca, their anus, and actually regrow them. So just like with those, crabs or shrimp that remove their claw, what they're usually doing here is trying to distract a predator that they are coming in contact with, and they'll basically say, okay, you eat my digestive tract and I will scoot away and survive. And then what they do is they're able to regenerate these organs basically from both sides of their body. They meet in the middle and they fuse, which to me is like something straight out of science fiction. It is absolutely fascinating what these, sometimes considered quite, simple animals can do. And what's really cool about this is there are some scientists that are looking into it to see if there's anything we can learn on the, for human medicine around this. But I just think these are such incredible animals. They're super important to the ecosystem. And if you'll permit me one last conservation note, unfortunately, sea cucumber populations across the world, including in Florida, have been threatened by over-harvesting. The demand for these animals are overwhelmingly coming from Asian markets, not so much for, food consumption, but rather they're used in like traditional or non-mainstream medical practices. I won't say specifically for what, but I think if you take a look at their body plans, you might, take a wild guess and get it right. But needless to say, they're a very important species to protect. And back in 2014, Florida did start regulating the take of these species to help keep their populations stable. And so hopefully, legislation like that or regulation like that can really help kind of keep the janitorial services of our coral reefs alive and well. So that's what I have for you today. These are the 4 groups of critters that we talked about. I really hope that you will remember some of this and have fun going out and spotting those critters. What I'll do is I'm happy to take some questions on either the echinoderms or the others. And then I've got another very kind of simple quiz where I'll show you pictures of the animals and see if you can remember some stuff about them if you want to stick around and enjoy that quiz. Before we get to the quiz, any questions?
A few questions. So one is just first a comment. There's one attendee who tends to see brittle stars inside of tube sponges. Not sure if that's a preferred habitat, but that could be a good tip for those who want
very
to
cool.
stars. And a question, just kind of going back to isopods, is it bad to eat crustaceans if they have those isopods attached to them?
Not in the sense that the isopod will like become a parasite to you, but they're probably not too delicious. And so what I would recommend is if you are going to eat a crustacean that has any sort of parasite is to remove those parasites, thoroughly cook the animal as you should with, you know, most seafood, and then enjoy it just fine. You know, I can't say for certain that it's not going to hurt you. I don't think it's going to do you any harm, but it's probably better to remove them.
Gotcha. Last question, in terms of sea cucumbers, it seems there is one kind of factoid going around that they have a toxin in them that can affect people's eyes. I don't know if that's anything that you know about.
I don't. Yeah, so I will say that, you know, because they're not really eaten very often, I don't really know how they would impact humans as we interact with them. But yeah, I haven't heard about this toxin. Thanks for letting us know.
Nor have I. And then another question that's come up is whether you know anything about the calico scallops that have been washing up on the East Coast shores.
The calico scallops, I do not. Generally speaking, if I can paint with a broad brush with like many of the bivalves, but especially our scallops, they're definitely facing challenges from things like land-based sources of pollution and you know, like impacts from basically a lot of the like coastal construction activities that we have. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's something related to basically land-based sources of pollution. So filter feeders in general, they're extremely efficient animals in terms of they filter huge amounts of water. But that also means that if there are things like toxins or pollutants in the water, it's very easy for those pollutants or toxins to basically collect inside the animal. So it doesn't even have to be like a terrible amount of this pollutant in the water, but since these animals can filter so much water, it really does get concentrated inside their bodies. And so my presumption would be there's probably something in the water that's not great for them.
Gotcha. And we do have one comment kind of answering the question about the sea cucumbers of the, there apparently the glands of Cuvier attached to the self-eviscerated intestines of sea cucumbers, and the surface toxin is a saponin and can blister mucous membranes such as conjunctiva and oral mucosa. So presumably,
oh, wow.
did not want to be right next to self-eviscerated.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I guess, yeah, so I guess it's almost like a dual purpose where, you know, potentially can distract whatever their predator is by saying, hey, eat this part, but also it can potentially have, you know, these toxins or anything else that can, you know, negatively impact whatever's trying to eat them, so they'll scoot away. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Thanks for letting us know.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. And those are all the questions that we have.
Awesome. In that case, it's my favorite time. So what we're going to do for this quiz is I'm going to show you some pictures and I'll ask you basically for their common name and maybe one more thing about them. What you can do is drop your answer into the question box. And Rachel, you can let me know what kind of great answers we're getting from folks.
Awesome.
So we're going to start. I am looking for the common name of this organism and whether or not it is a nudibranch.
One answer is sea slug and no.
All right. Any other answers from the group?
Lots of no, it's not a nudibranch. We have one answer saying it is a Sacoglossum elysia, painted elysia.
Nice. Yep. Sounds like all, oh, it's advancing. Nope. Lots of great answers. It is indeed the painted elysia, and it is not, in fact, a nudibranch. It is a sea slug. All right, I'm looking for the common name, and if you can remember the name of the genus. As a hint, think about the shape of its gills.
We have Christmas tree worms and Spirobranchi.
You guys are awesome.
Yes.
Yeah. So we have the Christmas tree worm or the Spirobranchus giganteus. All right, next up, I'm looking for the common name, and how delicious do you think this animal is?
Spiny lobster, and very good. Lots of good answers here. 10 out of 10.
10 out of 10. All right, so indeed, it's the Caribbean spiny lobster, and my friend Julie always says it's more delicious than crawfish, but less than blue crab. All right, I'm looking for the common name of this organism. Bonus points if you can remember the Latin name. And generally speaking, why do we like to see this organism on our reefs?
We have diadema and long-spine urchin or long-spine sea urchin and diadema antillarum. And the functionality that we're getting is that it's a lawnmower and that it cleans the algae.
Awesome. Indeed, the long spine urchin or diadema antillarum, and we call it the lawnmower of the reef because indeed it keeps that algae in check. All right, I'm looking for the common name of this organism and where you might find it. Picture's a little bit of a hint, but think about what it eats.
We have a lot of folks saying flamingo tongue, some that it'll be on octocorals, corals, gorgonians.
Yeah, nice job. Yep, so it's the flamingo tongue, and you'll find them on soft corals, specifically things like gorgonians or things like this, like your rope corals. All right, I'm just looking for the common name of this organism.
We have bearded fireworm.
All right. Sounds like consensus around indeed the bearded fireworm. All right, next up, we just got a couple more. I'm just looking for the common name for this organism.
Caribbean reef squid. We did have one cuttlefish, reef squid, Caribbean squid.
This is not the cuttlefish, it is the Caribbean reef squid. Yes, I know it looks a lot like a cuttlefish, but we, in my opinion, unfortunately, don't have any cuttlefish, at least that we know about, along Florida's coral reef. All right, I'm looking for the common name of this alien.
Basket star, giant basket star.
Indeed, it is the giant basket star. Okay, I think we've just got a couple more of these. I'm looking for the common name of this organism. And what were those cool chemosensory organs called towards the front of the animal? Kind of hard to see, but I think it's these.
Sea hair is being given, and also the rhinophores.
Amazing. So this is a sea hare, and it's got those chemosensory organs, the rhinophores at the front. All right, I'm looking for the common name, if you can remember, and whether or not this is a nudibranch.
We are getting a yes on the nudibranch, one on it being a sea goddess.
Great. Yep, we call this the regal sea goddess, and it is indeed a nudibranch, and you can see these exposed, the naked gills here at the back.
It looks very regal.
Very regal. All right, I'm looking for either or both of the common names of this organism and whether or not it will give me a manicure.
Banded shrimp, banded cleaner shrimp, and yes on the manicure.
Yeah, so it's two names. We either call it the banded coral shrimp or the barber pole shrimp. Just because that second name, it might give you a haircut instead of a manicure. All right, the very last one, I promise. Just looking for the unfortunate common name of this wonderful animal.
Donkey dung sea cucumber seems to be the consensus.
That is indeed correct. It is the donkey dung sea cucumber. All right. Well, that's all I got for you today. Thanks so much if you stuck around this long. Here's my email. If you got any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, or you can reach out to the DEP email address. But genuinely, I hope that you learned something today, that maybe you'll be able to find some of these new critters when you're out there on Florida's coral reef, and generally speaking, enjoy your time out there. So thanks so much, and I'm happy to stick around if folks have additional questions. But otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your evening, and hopefully you'll get to enjoy more courses like this soon. All right, thanks.